I think we can start. Atul, you set up recording.
We can, yes, sir, we have begun recording, yes.
Right. People will be rolling up, I think. Right. All right. Welcome everyone to the final installment of Citing Vulnerability, the lecture series. This is season one, finishing today. Uh, uh, it ends on a note of climate emergency, if you might notice Johan's title. So it's perhaps quite appropriate that we think in emergency terms, so to speak. I'm delighted to have Johan from Linnaeus University Concurrences Center in Colonial Studies, Colonial and Postcolonial Studies, Sweden, with us for this final installment. Johan, meet our team, the UNESCO Chair's team members. You've already met Atul, who was in when you joined. My colleague, Professor Anna Korean, who's faculty chair, is also here, except that she has reported a lot of noise outside her house due to election campaigns, which are very colorful, very noisy things in India, as you might perhaps be aware. So she will get online to speak maybe towards the end. And welcome to everybody else here. The series has examined, some of you who have participated in this on other occasions with other speakers, has examined various forms and sites of vulnerability, whether it has the normal working class sector to the Gothic version of vulnerability. It has used literary texts, popular cinema, and a whole group of texts to the people. Meenakshi, are you here?
I'm here, sir.
All right. Okay, Johan, so you met Atul. This is Meenakshi Shrihari, our other project assistant, who's also just joined in, and I already introduced. So thank you, Johan, for agreeing to speak at a more civilized level for you here, unlike the people from across the Atlantic who were, like I was saying, more or less woke up with a milk supply van to speak to us. We're very much looking forward to what I think is a huge topic. I was about to say a hot topic, but given that it's climate change and global warming might seem wholly inappropriate as a colloquialism. And we look forward to listening to you on the racial Capitalocene, which some of the people who are here might be aware of, people talking about the Plantationocene and the Anthropocene's options, and Franco Verges's take on the Capitalocene as a racialized structure. So Johan's focus on the racial Capitalocene and the climate emergency narrative and consequences in terms of vulnerability are all very, very significant for us today. And I'll hand this over to Atul for the remaining part of the honors in the introduction. Over to you, Atul.
Thank you, sir, and welcome once again, Professor Höglund. And if I may introduce you formally to the audience, uh, Dr. Johan Höglund is Professor of English in the Department of Languages at Linnaeus University in Sweden and a member of the Linnaeus University Center for Concurrences in Colonial and Postcolonial Studies. He holds degrees from Brown University and the Uppsala University. His research focuses on the relationship between popular culture and empire as it manifests during different eras and in different media, and on how fiction narrates the ongoing planetary emergency. He is the author of the monograph The American Imperial Gothic, Popular Culture, Empire, Violence, published by Ashgate in 2014, and is the editor and co-author of Dark Scenes from Damaged Earth, The Gothic Anthropocene, published by the Minnesota University Press in 2021, Nordic Gothic, the Manchester University Press in 2020, and B-Movie Gothic, International Perspectives, published by the Edinburgh University Press in 2018. Today, his talk is titled Vulnerability, the Racial Capitalocene, and the Climate Emergency Narrative. Over to you, Professor Höglund.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for that kind introduction.
I'm honored to join this lecture series and grateful to Professor Nayar and the organizers for this opportunity to converse with you. The topic that I will speak on today comes out of a project that I've been working on for 2 years, and that was funded by the Swedish Foundation Riksbankens Jubileumsfond. It will be published in the form of an open access monograph next year by Palgrave. And the talk will be divided into 2 main sections. The first will be theoretical and historical and focus political science, geopolitics, and international relations. And it will consider, in particular, the relationship between declarations of climate emergency and what Immanuel Wallerstein has termed the capitalist world system. In the second part of the talk, I will turn to what has been termed climate fiction, and from the vantage of the first part, explore possibilities, but also considerable limitations that are attached to this genre of writing as it narrates different types of emergency. That brings me to the first section. When the European Parliament declared a climate emergency on the 29th of November 2019, they latched onto a growing trend initiated by the City Council of Durban, a suburb of Melbourne, Australia, in December 2016. And since then, 39 countries and 2,100 local governments have followed suit, because such declarations oppose climate change denial. They are often welcomed by climate scientists and activists. Indeed, there's every reason to consider the current erosion of the biosphere and the ongoing 6th mass extinction of species as precisely an emergency for the planet and for the many species that inhabit it, including, of course, the human species. That said, almost all nations that have declared an emergency are either islands that have begun to disappear due to sea level rise, or, and this is the dominant trend, they're located in what is typically labeled the global north. Even if some of these nations are located in the geographical south, it looks like this. So this is a map of the nations that have declared a nationwide climate emergency or a partial climate emergency for certain regions. If we compare this to a map of the nations most likely to suffer from climate change, the most vulnerable nations, we get a different picture. This map describes that, and it's been produced by the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Initiative, and it measures and ranks different nations of vulnerability and readiness to adapt to climate change, so the nations that are most at risk here. And as you can see, it's almost the inverse of the previous map. Why is it that the most vulnerable nations, the nations most likely to suffer greatly from climate change, are also the ones least likely to declare a climate emergency? Indeed, what does it mean to declare a climate emergency, and what do such declarations lead to? A declaration of a climate emergency can serve a very important purpose. Indigenous people in different parts of the world have urged governments to declare climate emergency so that their severe vulnerability becomes formally recognized by those nations. Again, the planet is indeed experiencing an emergency at this stage in history. For all the species that are at home in the Holocene period, that has reigned for the past 11,000 years or so, since the end of the last ice age, the entry into a new and much warmer era is extremely difficult. As noted by a number of science reports, the 6th mass extinction in the history of the Earth has in fact begun. The 5th mass extinction, it might be added, occurred when a meteor collided with the Earth some 65 million years ago and caused the demise of the dinosaurs. So there's reason to declare a climate emergency, but declarations of climate emergencies do not automatically lead to the type of change that is actually required to prevent the Holocene period from conclusively ending. Mike Holm has observed that declarations of emergency are often a way for states and other actors to manage conditions of war, insurrection, or terrorist threat through the suspension of normal politics. Indeed, the declaration of an emergency typically prompts the establishment of what Hannah Arendt and Georgia Agamben have called a state of exception. And this provides states and state actors with extra legal powers. An example is the US war on terror, a state of exception that was a response to the emergency constituted by the terror attacks of 9/11. The object of this state of exception was to restore the system to its prior function, to get back to business as usual for the United States. Indeed, it can be argued that the main reason for declaring an emergency and introduce a state of exception is so that the system under threat can return to its prior function, so to restore its status quo. This endeavor to restore business as usual is always problematic, since it is typically business as usual that has produced the emergency in the first place. This is exceptionally true in the case of the climate crisis. And to appreciate this fact, I need to connect with some of the work that has been devoted to explaining the origins of the climate crisis. Well, the most common denominator used to name the present climate period is Anthropocene, where anthro stands for humanity. It is not humanity as a species that is caused biospheric breakdown, as Rebecca Duncan observed and as Professor Nayard just mentioned. The driver of the climate crisis isn't humanity. It is also a number of scientists have begun to argue capitalism and colonialism. It is what Immanuel Wallerstein calls the capitalist world system. The system begins to emerge with the establishment of colonies in America during the 17th century. It is in connection with this process that indigenous land is enclosed, privatized, and transformed into extractable resource. Land in the New World, especially in the South, was enormously fertile during colonization. It supplied a great deal of what environmental historian Jason W. Moore has termed cheap nature. And this is nature that yields substantial profit without considerable investment. And capitalism thrives on such nature, and it existed in abundance in the New World. However, the monocrop plantations that settlers established quickly depleted the land, which is one important reason why there was a need for settler colonizers to push westward in America towards regions that had not yet been depleted in this way. And as Andreas Malm and Alfon Boy have argued, the invention of the coal-fueled steam engine was prompted by the need to increase the speed and the reach of this development. Coal and oil did precisely this. You could spread the system more widely, dig deeper into the land, into mountains, into seabeds. You could transport labor and commodities more quickly and efficiently with the help of fossil fuels. And this also accelerated soil erosion, while at the same time releasing increasingly vast amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So in this way, to make a complex history very short, colonial capitalism has organized not only economic and social relations throughout history, but also ecology. And this is why the biosphere is breaking down at this moment. The climate crisis is not a joint human project, but an effect of the perceived need to turn nature into commodities and to accumulate the profits of these commodities. It is because of this that Moore has proposed the concept of the capitalist world ecology as a more precise version of Wallerstein's concept. He's also suggested the denominator Capitalocene as a better concept than the Anthropocene. And I know that you've been talking about this, so I'm sure that you recognize it. As Moore clearly acknowledges, and as François Verger has discussed, there is an important racial element to this, to the Capitalocene and to the capitalist world ecology. The people who were folded into capitalism as resources as cheap labor were frequently racialized. Race in its current form is, as Frederick Robinson has argued, a capitalist invention to a large extent. It defined people of color as resource as well, from slavery to the sweatshops where clothes for the world market is produced today. A consequence of the racialization of the capitalist world system or world ecology is the salient fact that the majority of people that inhabit the areas that are likely to suffer the most due to the climate crisis are people of color. Thus, Verger's terms the present moment the racial Capitalocene, and that is how I use it in this talk. What does this mean for the notion of a climate emergency? Bringing colonial capitalism into the discussion is crucial if we want to understand why some nations have declared a climate emergency and some have not, and when we try to understand what emergency means in these declarations. An important point here is that the erosion of the planet is a crisis or an emergency, not just for the planet, but also for capitalism. Moore shows in his research how cheap nature is running out and how capitalism is desperately trying to invent new ways of generating profit. It is no longer possible to simply move your plantation further west or south to find new and fertile land. There is organized resistance against turning the Amazon into palm oil plantations, and so much of the land not governed by indigenous people has become so depleted that it cannot function without large quantities of chemical fertilizers. And this is the topic of Hannah Holloman's book, Dust Bowls of Empire, Imperialism, Environmental Politics, and the Injustice of Green Capitalism. And she makes the point that the soil of the planet has been so thoroughly depleted by colonial capitalism that the existing agricultural system risks collapsing. To make a profit in this depleted world, capitalism needs to capitalize and deregulate. The neoliberal gig economy that has become the standard in most parts of the world is one attempt by the world system to manage this shortage of cheap nature. So in other words, you can say that we have two interrelated crises that are interlinked, nested, but also in certain ways different. One is the crisis experienced by a multi-species, human and non-human planetary society, and it manifests this crisis as Donna Haraway and Anat Singh have described as a lack of refuge where species can recuperate. The same crisis also manifests as a lack of social justice, equality, food security, healthcare, and education. And this is how Cristina Figueres, one of the former directors of the work that the UN was doing to avert the climate crisis. This is how she puts it. The climate crisis, the nature crisis, the inequality crisis, the food crisis all share the same deep root, extractivism based on extrinsic principles. So the other crisis then is the crisis of capitalism, or how this is a crisis for capitalism. It is a crisis experienced by the capitalist world system as cheap nature is running out. The first crisis is produced by the system's attempt at managing its own crisis. It is capitalism's attempt to bring more coffee or other cash crops out of the land that produces a lack of refuge for other species and a lack of food when land is used to grow coffee instead of edible crops. This produces soil erosion and increased emissions of greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide. Similarly, it is capitalism's attempt to make people work for less money that produces the inequality crisis. And this is a circular problem. Soil erosion creates more inequality and smaller profits, which leads to more inequality and more soil erosions, and so on. And Moore has suggested that we're now at a terminal or epochal stage for capitalist crisis, that capitalism may not survive what is in front of it. These crises are completely interlinked and interdependent, yet they're also profoundly different. It should be added, and this is Figueroa's point, of course, that you cannot solve the ecological and human crisis if you don't address the root cause, the extractivist paradigm that is central to capitalism. Now let's turn back to the declaration of emergency made by these various nations. Which of these two related crises or emergencies are they primarily concerned with? And what are they doing to try to address this emergency? When they declare a climate emergency, what type of crisis are they really trying to alleviate and address? So far, many of the nations and organizations that have declared a climate emergency have backed off on their commitments to reduce emissions. Doing so will affect the economy of these capitalist powerhouses too much. To the extent that emissions are being curbed, this is done through a turn towards what is called green capitalism, investments in technologies and energy forms that are less erosive and that constitute a new frontier for capitalism. They are still erosive, though, it needs to be stressed. In this way, it can be argued that most governments that have declared a climate emergency are involved in an effort to save capitalism rather than the planet. Declaring a climate emergency makes possible a politics, a geopolitics that is shallow and short-sighted and that does not address the root causes. As Rebecca Duncan et al. Have argued, by framing climate change as an imminent but manageable disaster, it becomes possible to bypass questions relating to where this disaster comes from, thereby licensing solutions that reproduce and work in the interest of the extractive colonial system. In other words, the declaration of climate emergencies risk accelerating both biospheric breakdown and already existing inequalities in the world system. The key problem, extractivism, is not addressed. I will now turn to literature, film, and other speculative media and consider what this means for how the climate crisis is narrated in stories taking place in futures transformed by biospheric breakdown, but also by rampant capitalist crisis. Texts that deal with this is typically labeled climate fiction. Most of you, I'm sure, are well aware of this genre, but just to define it, it is a body of literature that begins to surface after the Second World War in the wake of the realization that powerful states now have the ability to radiate and pollute the biosphere to such an extent that it may become hostile to human life. In the early 21st century, when climate science reports are becoming increasingly alarming, the number of novels and films concerned with global warming increases exponentially. There's now a significant number of studies on this type of fiction, and the prevailing assumption is that such fiction is, as argued by Greger Andersen, a vital supplement to the reports published by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, because by depicting humans in worlds resembling those forecast by the IPCC, climate fiction provides speculative insight into how it might be to feel and understand in such worlds. It has even been argued that climate fiction, as Imogen Malpas has argued, provides us with the beginnings of the roadmap we so sorely need to achieve a global society that is both abundant and sustainable. And I think there are such stories, and that they perform precisely this kind of work. I note, however, that most that write stories capable of supplying roadmaps of some sort come from the margins of what Wallerstein calls the capitalist world system, or from the peripheries. These are novels by indigenous authors, people of color, marginalized by dominant society, or by politically radical anti-capitalist and anti-colonial writers and filmmakers. And these are novels that exemplify such writing. However, most climate fiction does not emerge out of these peripheries or out of these radical positions. Most climate fiction is published in the global north, in the United States. And it typically centers a white, formerly middle-class subject who has been deprived of the privileges and the safety once afforded by capitalist modernity. An often cited example is this novel by Cormac McCarthy, The Road, which is about a father and his young son and how they make their way through an utterly depleted natural and human world where nothing grows and where the only thing there is to eat is what can be scavenged from abandoned houses. There is little such food, so people have begun to eat other people as well. So this is a future of constant emergency for formerly privileged people. And in what follows now, I will briefly consider three other examples that also evoke the notion of a constant emergency. But they suggest ways, they also suggest ways of in which this emergency can be managed. And the first is a multi-volume series, fiction series called Helldivers, authored by Nicholas Sansbury Smith. The second are two major Hollywood blockbusters, Godzilla and Godzilla King of the Monsters. And the third is a critically acclaimed climate fiction novel, Dog Stars by Peter Heller. All these texts take place in worlds very similar to those described by indigenous or radical climate fiction. But as I will show, they propose very different ways of managing the emergencies that they evoke. If we turn first to the Helldiver series, it takes place in a future ravaged by a Third World War, and these are 8 of these novels. These are mass market paperbacks that are sold very cheaply, and sometimes also ghost written by other authors. As I said, it takes place in a future ravaged by World War. This war has left the land so polluted by radioactivity and toxic substances, and so ravaged by constant electrical storms that it's become impossible to live on the surface of the planet. If the electrical storms and lethal radioactivity were not enough, incredibly aggressive life forms are now dominant on the planet's surface, and you can sort of see some of that in these pictures. There's a new, resilient, aggressive, mutant being on the planet's surface, intent on killing and consuming its human ancestors wherever they are found. So to survive, what remains of humanity has been forced to escape in enormous airships that sail above the storms and the fallout that have ruined the biosphere. And this is one such airship, or an impression of one such airship. To keep the ships from falling back to the planet and to keep the struggling few hundred on board each ship alive, a cadre known as Helldivers parachute through the storms to retrieve fuel cells, pharmaceuticals, and ammunition vital to survival. These soldiers, at constant war with the destroyed and raging planet, are what keeps the remnant of humanity airborne. As the novel states on a number of occasions, Helldivers, quote, dive so humanity survives, end quote. A first thing to note here is that these novels externalize nature into an essentially hostile and vengeful entity. Nature may be experiencing an emergency in these texts, but it is even more an emergency in itself, an emergency for the few humans that remain. Thus, it is an entity that needs to be constantly fought by the militia on this airship. This militia is doing the best it can, but things are not going very well. By the time the first novel of the series plays out, only 2 of the airships remain. And of these, one is already dying, and the other in even worse shape. It burns and crashes only 100 pages into the text. So humanity is effectively reduced to a gathering of hundreds crammed onto a single and failing airship. The only way for this fragment of humanity to survive in this future is to maintain faith in the militarized capitalist modernity that built the airship and that keeps it afloat. In each novel, The airship risks falling to the surface of the planet due to fuel shortage, to descent, to various illnesses, and the only way to manage these threats is to reinvest in the existing social order. This is a world of constant emergency, but an emergency for the survivors who have risen in these airships from the global north. It is also an emergency that can only be resolved through constant violence. My second example, the films Godzilla and Godzilla King of the Monsters, share a lot of DNA with Hal Divers. And these are films that reach an enormous audience. And if you are familiar with these types of stories, you know that Apple TV Plus just released a series, a televised series featuring the same kind of universe. The main character here, Godzilla or Gojira, is a movie monster invented by the Japanese filmmaker Ishiro Honda in 1954 in the wake of the atomic bombs detonated over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and also in the wake of multiple nuclear bomb tests performed by the US in the Pacific Ocean in the late 40s, 50s, and 60s. The original Godzilla or Gojira is often understood as an avatar of the planet who rises out of a prehistoric past to wreak vengeance on the human world that once created it. As such, Gojira is a kind of walking climate emergency. And in the Japanese original, Gojira is relentless and furious. It is a creature that appears to hate humans and human cities. It breathes atomic fire. It topples skyscrapers. It lays waste to Tokyo. It bites transportation trains, as you can see in this image. The new American Godzilla is clearly built on this figure. But the new series of films also alters the story to a great extent. As in the original, Godzilla and other gigantic monsters, also called kaijus, are clearly avatars of a damaged planet. They are the planet mistreated by human civilization. This is made perfectly clear in the film Godzilla, King of the Monsters, where one of the scientists, you can see her here on the right, explains the situation using the following words. She tells the audience and other people in the film, humans have been the dominant species for thousands of years, and look what's happened: overpopulation, pollution, war. The mass extinction we feared has already begun, and we are the cause. We are the infection. But like all living organisms, the earth unleashed a fever to fight this infection. Its original and rightful rulers, the Titans. They are part of the Earth's natural defense system, a way to protect the planet, to maintain its balance. But if governments are allowed to contain them, destroy them, or use them for war, the human infection will only continue to spread. And within our lifetime, our planet will perish, and so will we, unless we restore balance. In this way, Godzilla and the other Titans, there are many monsters in these films, are clearly described as a response to violence perpetrated on the planet. Although the blame for this violence is laid on humanity as a species rather than on colonialism and capitalism, the film appears to encourage an awareness of, as Anderson put it, how it might be to feel and understand in worlds transformed by climate change. It feels like being hammered by a 400 feet monster who breathes atomic fire and who wades through cities. This even appears to provide us with the beginnings of a roadmap. We need to restore balance. So far, so good. However, as soon as these words are out of the mouth of the scientist, we find out that she has gone rogue. She has joined forces with an eco-terrorist who is just making things worse by releasing too many monsters into the Earth's biosphere, and has been funding his own work by selling monster DNA. The scientist may be correct in her analysis that human activity has been destroying the planet, but her path towards eco-restoration is described in the film as the wrong one. To make things even more complicated, it turns out that Godzilla isn't at all interested in getting humanity sorted out. Godzilla does destroy cities and he kills people, but only by accident. Godzilla's real enemy is another monster, Godira, that you can see here. He comes from outer space and he is trying to terraform the Earth by warming it. This, it turns out, is the actual climate emergency that plays out in this film, not capitalism or even humanity, but an external terrestrial entity. Godzilla fights this monster, but he does so alongside brave human soldiers, Navy men, pilots, and scientists. In both Godzilla films, there are ticking clocks that enhance the sense of emergency and immediacy. Action must be taken quickly by serious-looking officers and scientists. These are the only actors who can save the day. If the climate emergency is, as Moore and Malm and many others have argued, and as the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is increasingly arguing, caused by militarized science and fossil fuel capitalism, this is the entity that is called upon to save the day in these films. This is not surprising, since both Godzilla and Godzilla King of the Monsters were funded by the US Department of Defense. The US Department of Defense is not an organization focused on planetary health. It is an organization that is first tasked with protecting the borders of the US nation state and US capitalist society across the planet. It is also, notably, the world's single biggest consumer of hydrocarbons, of oil and coal. By sponsoring films where the US armed forces are described as saving humanity and the planet by doing violence on avatars of the planet, they not only participate in the production of the biospheric crisis as an emergency for capitalism, they propose that the only entities that can help rectify the crisis are agents that have, in fact, been central to the production of this crisis. As Robert P. Marsac in Militarizing the Environment, and as Christophe Bonnuil and Jean-Baptiste Fassot make clear in The Shock of the Anthropocene, the US military has played a central role for what Bonnuil and Fassot called a natural history of destruction. It is not strange, perhaps, that a movie paid for by the US Department of Defense would encourage an understanding of the climate crisis as an emergency that only US armed forces can set right. However, the notion that the US military can save the planet in any way is still absurd. And I want to turn to my final example before I wrap up. This is Peter Hell's The Dog Stars, an acclaimed climate narrative. This is a novel that takes place in a future where society has collapsed completely. Global warming and a pandemic engineered in a weapons lab have killed some 99.9% of all humans. Cities have turned into wastelands full of withered corpses, and the few survivors that remain have to walk like the father and the son of the road through a truly post-apocalyptic, post-capitalist future in search of whatever food and gear that can be sourced from the ruins. As in The Road, this has brought out the worst in people, so many wandering bands are cannibals and rapists who prey on others. The protagonists of the novel are very different from the father and the son of the road, however. The central characters of the novel are two white men, Hig and Bangley, and there's also a dog named Jasper. These survive on an airfield in Colorado. Hig hunts with his dog, and he also flies a small propeller airplane that allows him to check for dangers and to gather supplies from the ruins left behind. Bangley, on the other hand, is a prepper, an expert shooter, ruthless killer, and a survival with a capital S. Bangley arrived at the airfield one day loaded with sniper rifles, automatic guns, and even a mortar. He has established a parameter around the airfield, and he will kill anyone who enters this parameter, no questions asked. He will shoot and kill men, women, and children, and he will insist that Hig does the same, and Hig does the same. His creed, Bangley's creed is, old rules are gone, Hig, went the way of the woodpecker, gone with the glaciers and the government. New world now, new world, new rules, never ever negotiate. The Marxist literary critic Frederick Jameson has argued that it seems to be easier for us today to imagine the thoroughgoing deterioration of the earth and of nature than the breakdown of late capitalism. Perhaps that is due to some weakness in our imagination. In the Dog Stars, the breakdown of late capitalism and the breakdown of nature is really the same thing. This is a post-apocalyptic and post-capitalist world. It is also a world of constant emergency. Now that capitalist modernity has collapsed, nobody can be secure. What has taken over is Hobbes' war of all against war. This is why Bangley has established a parameter and why he kills everyone who enters it. Higg, who is the narrator of the novel and an essentially kind person, understands this, and he accepts the fact that they must kill all trespassers. This is the only way to stay safe in this future. As in Helldivers and Godzilla, the ecological world is a space of emergency. And in Helldivers and as in Helldivers and Godzilla, the only thing that will save you is the rehearsal of borders, of enclosures, and the ability to perform violence to protect these ontological and epistemological borders. The practices that created the climate emergency are represented as the only option, even when, as in the Dog Stars, no restoration is possible. So to conclude, my point here is that much of what is called climate fiction, defined as a new literary genre profoundly informed by climate science and engaged in an attempt to provide readers with roadmaps towards sustainable futures, is in fact so preoccupied with notions of climate emergency and the inevitability of capitalism that a better denominator is climate emergency narrative. These are texts that cast climate breakdown rather than the processes and systems that have produced it as the problem, and that insists that these processes and systems are also the only thing that can rectify the problem. By telling this story, they supply the general climate emergency discourse with a seductive narrative. Just like American television shows such as 24 and films such as Dark 030 cast the war on terror, the American war on terror after 9/11, as an emergency action aimed to stop the ticking of a devastating terrorist action. The climate emergency narrative casts climate change as an entity that in itself constitutes a threat to modernity, and that only modernity can come to terms with. The theme of this lecture series is Anthropocene and vulnerability. The Anthropocene, or Capitalocene if you prefer, is an emergency for the planet and for the people, in particular for those who inhabit especially vulnerable parts of the world. Yet, declarations of emergency often introduce policies that center the needs of the states that have declared them rather than the needs of the nations most vulnerable to climate change or the needs of a multi-species planet. Climate fiction can help us understand not just that the climate is deteriorating, but also why it is deteriorating and how uneven the experience of a climate crisis is. Climate fiction that performs this important work can help shift attitudes and create meaningful action. However, climate narratives such as the Dog Stars that leverage an imaginative horizon where the climate crisis is an emergency primarily for the global north, and that insists that the same entities that produce the crisis must set it right, risks setting the readers on the wrong path. If, as Figueres has claimed, the climate crisis, the nature crisis, the inequality crisis, the food crisis all share the same deep root, leaving the vulnerable behind and building a fortress around the global north will not save the planet or any human on it. We cannot come to terms with the climate crisis without first sorting out the inequality crisis and the food crisis. They are nested and interlinked in ways that make them part of the same meta crisis. That is the narrative that must be rehearsed in action as well as in literary texts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Höglund, for that fascinating and insightful talk on the climate change narrative, the climate emergency narrative. And I am sure the audience will have questions and comments for you. So the floor is now open to questions. Any questions, comments? Roy has a question. Roy, please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Höglund, for the enlightening presentation. I was wondering, in the context of the Godzilla films, the two films that you mentioned, Godzilla and Godzilla King of the Monsters, its sequel, even though, as you said, Godzilla and the US military are presented as the benevolent forces, uh, from the level of the ordinary people to whom the camera spans from time to time, both Godzilla and the antagonist monsters seem extremely destructive. Their actions, because they are too large in scale, as well as the US military. So there is a Japanese character who appears in both these films who constantly reiterates that both Godzilla and the US military are bona fide forces, as opposed to the villainous monsters. So the fact that the creators of the film needed to bring in somebody from Japan to give them this kind of bona fide, does it show some kind of insecurity in the larger narrative that the US is trying to portray here? Considering the fact that the character Dr. Serizawa is somebody from Japan, a nation that the US has caused generations of, let's say, climate or environmental damage to. That was my question.
Yeah, thank you for that interesting and insightful question. When the U.S. Department of Defense did not write this film, it had a group of, as all American major films have, they have a group of authors, and then they present the manuscript to the U.S. Department of Defense, and then they ask if they can have funding. And then the U.S. Department of Defense will say certain things. It will demand, if it invests a lot, it will demand that U.S. military people are heroic, and that the work that they do is constructive. And if the film is about climate change, a condition for funding the film will be the U.S. Department of Defense must be instrumental in restoring the climate. But at the same time, the authors are aware of the fact that this is initially a Japanese story, and they will want to acknowledge that. So I'm sure that the character, that Horisawa, the Japanese scientist who's a part of the science group, who talks about Godzilla and tries to resolve Godzilla, is a way for the film to acknowledge its Japanese roots, and also some of the violence that the US has performed on Japanese soil. That said, the atomic bomb tests in the Bikini region and the atomic bombs dropped over Japan are narrated in two very different ways in the two films. If you look at the credit sequence that opens the first Godzilla film, it turns the atomic bomb tests on the in the Pacific Ocean on the Bikini Islands into an effort to save the world from Godzilla. So it completely rewrites that story, sort of an altruistic attempt by the US military to save the planet from gigantic monsters. That is why they blow an atomic bomb in that region. In the second one, a different story is told. It's divided on this topic, and it does try to acknowledge Godzilla's roots. It does recognize that that the atomic weapon was a horrible thing, but it's also presented in the film, especially in the second film, as a kind of regenerative, and they blow an atomic weapon to revitalize Godzilla in the second film. I could talk forever about Godzilla and the Keiji, but I will stop there and see if there are any other questions. But thank you for that question.
Laboni, yes, please go ahead.
Hello, am I audible, Dr. Höglund?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. Thank you for that very insightful lecture. And I had a question. In the map of the countries, the nations which you said ratified the planetary emergency, climate change as an emergency, I saw Bangladesh as being one of the signatory countries. And I'm curious because Bangladesh is not positioned in the global north, and neither does it have the political strength to say to, and it also is in a way oppressed by global north capitalist industries like the garment industry and so on. So what would be the role, like what would be the impetus or role of a country like Bangladesh to join the narrative of climate emergency?
I think that Bangladesh is one of the first nations that have joined this effort for the right reasons. I mean, just like some of the island nations, Bangladesh. This is also true of Pakistan and of many other areas in the region. Suffer enormously from flooding. I think we will see nations in the global south, and this is true for some nations in the global, in South America as well. Some of them are declaring climate emergencies precisely because they are experiencing a profound ecological emergency that kills thousands every year, if not tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands. It's in this particular region, it's flooding that is the main problem. In other parts of the world, it's drought, and in these cases, it's an attempt to recognize and also a first step towards asking the global north for some kind of aid. If you've declared a climate emergency, you can in the UN speak to your need of some kind of assistance, and also you can put a bit more pressure on the global north to to curb its emission of greenhouse gases. China is the world's #1 polluter at the moment, but the history it's continuing a history that began in the global north. It's a complicated situation, but I do think that we'll see more nations in the global south declare climate emergencies, but it will be for slightly different reasons compared to the global north. This is a matter that I could speak on at great length, but I will stop there again to allow other people to ask questions. But thank you for that important question.
Thank you so much.
Saurav, yes, please go ahead. Saurav.
Uh, Thank you, sir, for that wonderful lecture. I was interested in a particular term that you used. I think it was quite insightful for me in the lecture. The idea of the racial Capitalocene. So I was thinking, could you talk about a bit more about the idea? Because as I've rightly said, that for example, how we mark the different contributors to something as what we call as the global climate crisis is also dependent on these two concurrent factors of capitalism and the countries whom we're categorizing in a certain racial way. I think as being a kind of villain for lack of a better word for to the cause. So when you bring in these when you bring in the history of cap colonial capitalism and the question of raciality there. So I thought they follow from one another, right? Because colonialist capitalism also came with a certain idea of how inferior certain races were for them. So I just wanted to ask you if you would explicate more on this term, because I thought that's a really interesting way to at least understand how we all, I mean, at this point, call the climate crisis is a collective problem, and it can sometimes address these issues that, for example, for a lot of the global south countries, they would not want to limit their emissions, because it's for them, it's a lifestyle issue, because most people want to, let's say in very simple terms, most people in the global south would want to buy cars, or or have that mark of a social affluence, and they would not want to do that. So how to please talk it over, talk a bit more.
Thank you for that. Also, very important question. There's so much to say on this matter, and I will try to be brief. But in being brief, I'm also going to have to leave out some important points, unfortunately. But let's first think about how people become racialized and why that is. And Robinson's claim that it's been supported by maybe by Moore as well, is that race is something that's invented by capitalism to legitimize a certain kind of systematic, you could call it oppression, but you can be folded into extractive processes as resource through racialization. This is how you could make or turn African people into slaves, being black marked as a figure who could be enslaved, right? So we have that kind of history, and when which also meant that people of color were not perceived as human in the same way as white men were perceived as being human and have agency, and they were also what Agamben is called homo sacer, that is not quite a human being without any political content, and we can connect this to the idea of sacrifice songs that it's become important to when the global north is trying to address the emergency. They're also saying that there are things that can be sacrificed here. We know what we need to do in order to save the environment. Everybody knows what we need to do to save the planet. That there's no mystery here. We have to stop releasing so much fossil fuel into the atmosphere, and we have to eat less meat. Right? It's super easy in that respect. But if you stop releasing so much fossil fuels into the atmosphere, it means you have to stop doing something that's actually making you a lot of money right now. So what they're saying is, okay, so we can't really stop doing that, so we have to sacrifice certain things. And also, in order to create a more sustainable world, in northern Sweden, in the area inhabited by the indigenous Sami, the only indigenous people in Northern Europe, or really in Europe, they found rare earth minerals that are essential to creating electric vehicles. And now the discussion is, should you sacrifice, they need this land for reindeer herding. So should you mine those lands and sacrifice this indigenous community and the land they live on, right? That's the notion of the sacrifice zone. We can sacrifice this so we get to keep capitalism, we get to keep our privileges. I mean, that is also, that taps into into people of color. People of color also become people who can be sacrificed, so that somehow the global north can maintain capitalism and the privilege that capitalism produces. Then, of course, this is something that people who speak for the global south say all the time. If you give us the task of fixing the climate emergency for you, if you sacrifice us, you won't be able to address the climate crisis, because it is also an inequality crisis. And either the global north have to invest enormous. The global north must invest enormously in the global south in order to address the inequality crisis that's really also fueling the climate crisis. And of course, in the global south, I mean, that is how the climate crisis manifests, through inequality, through not having, we don't have to talk about cars, but on having access to education, to food, to security, and so on. And as long as that is the case, the system will keep on being unbalanced. There's so many economic issues to address here as well. How the richest 1% of the world is really funneling money from the entire world, and how that also drives the climate crisis at the same time as it drives global inequality. There's so much to say about this, but thank you for that really important question. Hello?
Yes, Akshata has a question. Akshata, please go ahead.
Hello, sir. Thank you for the lecture. I was thinking, since we started off talking about the Anthropocene, and one of the concepts of the Anthropocene introduced is the idea of deep time, right? And I feel like a lot of climate fiction recently has been aware of the limitations of its own narrative structures. Like I was thinking of texts like Richard Powers' Overstory or Bewilderment, or Charlotte McConaughey's Migrations, that these are, in a sense, these texts are aware of a sense of inevitability of our own imaginations, that we cannot think beyond or act beyond capitalist imaginaries, or that we are, in a sense, contained by its infrastructures. On the other hand, I was thinking, there are texts like Jasmine Ward's Salvage the Bones, which refuses to, in a sense, budge from this very short 12-day period in which people are actually dealing with a hurricane. So I was wondering, what kind of temporality do you think climate fiction can invest in moving ahead, in a sense, to think its way out of these capitalist sort of limitations?
Thank you. That's a terrific question. I think that it is important to recognize the fact that the climate crisis does not emerge out of deep time. When I mean, a thesis that's been debunked by a lot of environmental humanities scholars, the theory that has been debunked has been the theory that the climate crisis begins 1 or 2 million years ago, when the Homo erectus discovers fire and learns to control fire. So there's like that's when the humans are set off towards global warming, and so there's a connection, a direct relationship between that discovery of fire and the building of the first steam engine, and so on. I think it's very important to recognize the existence of deep time at the same time. It doesn't mean that we can't talk about that. I mean, that it asks questions about human origins, but even more so, it begins to prod the relationship between the human and the planet. And I think one thing that is done so well in Overstory, it shows how humans have always been folded into ecology, how we are multi-species beings. And that is a story that's really important to tell. But at the same time, as you note, that the break between that deep multi-species history, evolutionary history, I mean, cows cannot digest grass. That's outsourced to bacteria. That's a process of evolution, and we're the same, right? We have more genes, bacteria with genes we have actually more bacteria in our bodies than we have cells in our bodies, and that's an evolutionary process that keeps us healthy. So that's a deep time history that we need to consider. But then I think it's enormously important to talk about how capitalism disrupts that deep history, and also the relationships that deep history makes visible. I think there's a lot of climate fiction out there, unfortunately, that does not really help us to understand why there is a climate emergency. And if you don't understand why, it's enormously difficult to be an agent or to take action that prevents biospheric breakdown from occurring. It's like playing a game where you don't know the rules. Nobody's explained them to you. You're not going to win. I hope that helped answer your question. But it's a really good question.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much once again, Professor Höglund. If there are no more questions, may I invite our project assistant, Dr. Meenakshi Srihari, for a formal vote of thanks?
Thanks, Atul. I would like to propose a formal vote of thanks to bring this session to a close. First off, I would like to thank Professor Johan Höglund for lending us his expertise and speaking to us about a wide variety of concepts, ranging from breaking down the Anthropocene itself for us, and then introducing the racial Capitalocene to us, and then talking to us about the emergency climate narrative. Thank you for the talk, and thank you also for introducing us to a wide array of examples ranging from ranging across post apocalyptic fiction as such, and talking to us also about the classics of climate fiction. Thank you also for very patiently responding to all the queries, and for opening up several streams of thought among us today. So this talk brings us to the end, as Professor Nair spoke to us during his introduction, of the first iteration of the Citing Vulnerability series, where we've seen a wide variety of talks about ranging from ethnographic research on India's laborers through to aging and literature, vulnerable languages, Gothic movies, and today we spoke about climate fiction, of course. So we hope everybody has had a good time and has taken away a lot from the series. Thank you once again to everybody who's turned up, and to the organizers. Thank you, Atul, for hosting this. Thank you.
And thank you so much for your attention and for very good, useful questions.
Thank you, Johan.
Thank you, Professor Höglund. Thank you.